Welcome to The Analytic Christian. I'm Jordan, and this is the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Max Baker-Hytch. I believe I'm saying your name correctly, right?
Yeah.
Yep. And we're going to be discussing a paper that he co-authored with Ben Page called Meeting the Evil God Challenge. You can actually access this paper right now by clicking the link in the description on this video. I highly recommend you go read the paper. And this is actually part 2 of, I guess, a mini series that I'm doing on the Evil God Challenge. In part 1, I interviewed Dr. Asha Lancaster Thomas, and she offered a defense of the challenge. And what you will hear today is a critique of the challenge. So thank you so much for coming on and joining me.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Jordan. And really glad that you had Asha on. As I was mentioning to you, we've had some friendly correspondence with her, and really glad that you have had the chance to sort of, have both of us on the show.
Cool. Well, we're going to dive right in. I guess first, how did you get interested in the Evil God Challenge to begin with?
I think it was almost certainly through hearing Stephen Law present it in a debate that he did, and I was, I was intrigued by it. I think actually it was when Stephen Law debated Alistair McGrath at the Oxford Literary Festival, and this must have been maybe about 2011, and I was just, I thought it was like an intriguing argument. It was not something I'd come across before, and so I read his paper, which he published in Religious Studies. But it wasn't really till many years later that I talked with Ben Page, who's the co-author on this paper. And we started thinking through kind of some possible responses to Law's paper, and that grew into our own paper, which we ended up publishing in Pacific Philosophical Quarterly. And I think it's probably worth giving a slight caveat that with anything that's co-authored, there's always an extent to which it's not necessarily the case that both co-authors are as enthusiastic about every bit of the paper as each other. So that there may be some bits such as privation theory of evil, where I think Ben would be more kind of enthusiastic about that than I would be, and vice versa. There would be other bits that he's less enthusiastic, but that I felt should be included. So yeah,
and I'll ask you a couple of points like that as we go. First, what is the Evil God Challenge?
Yeah, so I think the easiest way to explain it is it's a parity argument. So in philosophy, a parity argument is where you have the argument that you want to critique, and then you come up with an argument that is supposed to have the same structure, or it's supposed to be in some sense a mirror of the argument you want to critique. But this second argument you've come up with is just obviously ridiculous. And the idea is, well, if there really is a kind of mirroring going on, then the original argument must be as ridiculous as the one that you've come up with as the parody. So the way that works with the Evil God Challenge, the idea is to say that belief in an all evil, an all powerful, all knowing, but all evil God is just as reasonable as belief in an all good, all powerful, all knowing God. And we'll go into and break down a little bit that claim that it's just as reasonable. But the idea is, they try to, the evil God challenger, that's what I'll call the person who puts this challenge forward. That's not someone who believes in an evil God, but someone who's using this as a parody to kind of ridicule the good God hypothesis. So the evil God challenger says they're on a par with each other. They're kind of symmetrical. They're as reasonable as each other. Belief in a good God, belief in an evil God. And so if you think that, as like virtually everyone on planet Earth thinks, if you think that belief in an all evil God is silly, ridiculous, then you should also think that belief in a good God is just as ridiculous, given that there's this symmetry between the two. So that's roughly how the argument's meant to work.
All right. And you give a formal structure of the argument in the paper. And so I've put that on the screen if you want to walk us through those steps of the argument.
Sure. So, so premise one says that GG just means the good God hypothesis is approximately epistemically symmetrical to EG, that's the evil God hypothesis. So epistemically symmetrical, what does that mean? So basically, I think we're going to unpack this a bit more in a minute. But basically, you could think of it as saying that, all of the evidence that goes in favor of the good God equally goes in favor of the evil God. All of the objections to the good God are just as strong as that there are objections just as strong to the evil God. All of the kind of defenses that someone might put up to defend the good God against the objections, such as the problem of evil, can be kind of run in reverse with just as much plausibility to defend the evil God against objections like the problem of why there's so much goodness. So the idea is that they're just as reasonable as each other. That's what it means to say they're epistemically symmetrical. Okay, then the second premise of the argument says that in general, if you've got two hypotheses, H1 and H2, that are roughly epistemically symmetrical, then the probability, the level of confidence that you should assign to hypothesis 1 is the same as the level of confidence you should assign to hypothesis 2. And so that the sort of sub-conclusion, step 3, is that the probability, the epistemic probability, as philosophers would say, the sort of the degree of confidence that you ought to assign to the good God hypothesis being true, given all of the evidence, is approximately the same as the epistemic probability, that the level of confidence you should give to the evil God being true, given all of the evidence. But now that there's one further premise before we get to the ultimate conclusion, which is that so far the evil God challenger has just allegedly established that these two hypotheses are kind of on a par with each other. But you've got to then add in the further step that the probability of the evil God being true is very low. And the person, the evil God challenger, I think reasonably assumes that everyone will agree with step 4, right? Certainly I would agree with that the probability of an evil God is very low. I would guess you do, Jordan. So when you combine 3 and 4, you get the final conclusion of the argument, which is that the probability of the good God, given all of the evidence, is also very low.
Okay, good job. Mm-hmm. We want to focus on, well, I'll leave it up for just a moment. Premise 1, that's the symmetry thesis. And this came up in my interview with Asha Lancaster Thomas. The symmetry thesis, I like the way you all divide it up in the paper. You say that there are these 3 sub-theses within it. Yes. So why don't you lay out each of those sub-theses?
Yeah, okay, good. So, I mean, this way of dividing it up is, I think, implicit in previous writing on the evil God challenge. That Ben and I choose to make it very explicit and use it as an important way of framing the discussion. So this idea that the two hypotheses, good God and evil God, are symmetrical, they're sort of on a par with each other, can be broken down into 3 kind of aspects. So the first one is what we call intrinsic symmetry. So the idea is when you're just thinking about not anything to do with the evidence that we find in the actual world, like evil or fine-tuning or any of that kind of thing. You're just focusing on the concept itself of a good God and the concept of an evil God. And the idea is that if there's intrinsic symmetry between the two hypotheses, then the concepts are intrinsically, that's to say, when you're just thinking about the contents of those two hypotheses, they are intrinsically as plausible as each other. Or to put it another way, it's as plausible that the good God is a coherent statement or hypothesis as it is that the concept of an evil God is coherent. So that's aspect one. The second aspect is what we call natural theology symmetry. So natural theology in general, right, is the project of looking at the world and kind of inferring the existence of God, be it from apparent design or the fact that the universe began to exist, or that there's consciousness and so on. So the idea is to say that there's natural theology symmetry between the two hypotheses is to say that all of the natural theological arguments lend roughly equal support to the good God hypothesis and to the evil God hypothesis alike. So that's to say the natural theological arguments, design arguments, and just about as much support to the good God as they do to the evil God, right? And then the third aspect is what we call theodicy symmetry. Okay, so famously the good God hypothesis faces the objection that there's a huge amount of evil in the world, and why would a good God allow so much evil? And theists, believers in the good God, over the centuries have come up with what are called theodicies, which are basically stories or explanations which posit reasons that a good God might have for allowing evil to occur in the world. Things like free will, or the possibility of cultivating virtues like courage in the face of danger and so on. And the idea is that to say that there's theodicy symmetry between the two hypotheses, good God and evil God, so to say all of those theodicies which theists, good God believers, offer can be run in reverse, can be sort of mirrored to explain why an evil God would allow there to be so much goodness in the world. So, for example, an evil God would take what's sometimes called the soul-making theodicy, which is the idea that that a good God would allow evil because it would allow the possibility for our characters to be built through experiences of hardship. We would get the opportunity to develop things like patience, endurance, courage, and so on. Well, the idea is that you can just sort of mirror that, and for the evil God, well, the reason the evil God allows so much goodness in the world is because he wants to sort of allow us to have opportunities to corrupt our characters. So he allows us wealth so that we become greedy, for example. So the idea is that the evil God challenger tends to want to claim that more or less for all of the major theodicies that are put forward on behalf of a good God to explain the problem of evil, these can be mirrored with just about as much plausibility to produce what you could call reverse theodicies to try and explain why an evil God would allow so much goodness.
Okay, so the three sub-theses were there's intrinsic symmetry, natural theology symmetry, and theodicy symmetry. Now, does the proponent of the evil God challenge need all three of those symmetries to hold in order for the challenge to work?
Well, Ben Page and I argue that they do. However, some of the evil God challengers allege that they can sort of bracket to one side intrinsic symmetry and not have to worry about that, and that they can sort of as long as the other two symmetries hold, natural theology and theodicy symmetry, they can still make the argument work. And the idea is that, and this is in the paper what we refer to as the bracketing move. So the idea is that, well, so even if intrinsically the concept of an evil God is less plausibly coherent than the concept of an all-good God, the evil God challenger says, well, that doesn't matter because the reason that we reject the evil God, or the reason actually that theists reject the evil God hypothesis, is not because of the intrinsic coherent stuff. It's because there's just it's because there's too much goodness in the world, that the problem of good, as it were, just kind of blows the evil God hypothesis out of the water. And so they say, the evil God challenger, well, as long as theodicy symmetry still holds, then that carries over, and then the theist should also think that the problem of evil blows the good God out of the water. So that's the idea. That's the way that some of not all, I should say. There's one paper that's been published in this literature recently that doesn't try to claim this, but yeah, a number of the defenders of the evil God challenge do try this, what we call this bracketing move.
So how do you respond to that kind of bracketing move?
Yeah, I think quite simply by just saying, well, I think that move that will only work with theists, that will only have any traction with theists who grant the idea that the evil God challenge, that the evil God hypothesis is just blown out of the water by the problem of good, which I simply just don't think is the case. That's not the reason that I reject the evil God hypothesis. I think that it is much less intrinsically plausible. I think it's much less plausible that it's intrinsically coherent than the good God hypothesis. I will say, however, I also Ben Page and I argue that all three of the symmetries break down actually. So there's actually a number of ways in which we think the bracketing move doesn't work, because the bracketing move relies on two things, right? It relies on saying there's a roughly perfect symmetry at the level of the problem of evil and the problem of good, and the theodicies which can respond to those. And the problem of good is just like devastating to the evil God, and we don't grant either of those claims. So yeah, we don't think the bracketing move works.
Okay, so with the remainder of the interview, what I basically want to do is see ways that you think each one of those symmetries break down. So we're already kind of on the topic. Let's start with the intrinsic symmetry.
Yeah.
How do you all argue that symmetry doesn't hold in between good God and evil God?
Yeah. So basically, the way we approach this in the paper is to say that there's a number of kind of metaphysical theses to do with God and the relationship between God and goodness, or the relationship between God and goodness and evil. And some of these have a long historical pedigree, and if any of these theses are true, then an evil God is conceptually impossible. And we say, and the point we want to make is not that we necessarily are confident in any particular one of these theses being true, but just that when you have a lot of different theses, that your hypothesis relies on them being all false, whereas the good God hypothesis is compatible with all of them, then the evil God hypothesis is a lot less plausible when you kind of take a step back. And so, I mean, just it's probably worth saying in general in philosophy, when people put forward a kind of a theory, it's just kind of common sense that you want that theory to be compatible with as many other theories as possible, right? The more your theory is committed to the falsehood of like various other theories, which have got some level of plausibility, the less plausible your theory is, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And I think in the paper I almost think of it as a pie, and you want. I guess the question is like, how much of that pie can the evil God hypothesis occupy? And
Right.
it seems like if it makes more claims, or maybe not more claims, but if it's incompatible with more claims than the good God, then in terms of the probability of the evil God hypothesis being true just automatically takes up
Yeah.
less of the pie.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think one thing I'd say quickly is that because, I mean, some people don't really like talking about probability when it comes to metaphysics. Some people think that it's sort of does weird or somehow inappropriate to use probability unless you're talking about contingent empirical facts, right? So that's why I didn't. You're correct. In the paper, we do talk about it in terms of probability, and the way you just described it is just right. I think you can also put the point and make basically the same point by saying that the more propositions that your hypothesis is incompatible with, the less plausible your hypothesis is.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so yeah, what are some of these areas that the evil God hypothesis is going to face? Like, it doesn't seem like it's compatible with those, but the good God hypothesis does seem like it's compatible with those.
Yeah, that's good. So I'll talk about just two. So one of them is what's sometimes known as the privation theory of evil, and the other one is what's sometimes known as the moral motivation, moral motivation internalism. So let me try and just describe them briefly. So the privation theory of evil. Now, I just want to say that I'm not kind of especially confident about the privation theory of evil or the general view of goodness that it falls out of. I would say my co-author Ben is more kind of enthusiastic about it. But I mean, and the point is simply that this is a hypothesis that I think does deserve to be taken seriously. Pretty much anyone in contemporary ethics, meta ethics today who is a sort of Aristotelian is going to have a view of goodness and evil that is like this view that I'm about to describe, and that's actually quite a lot of philosophers. I think for that reason, it's if the evil God hypothesis is incompatible with that, whereas the good hypothesis is compatible with it, then that seems like a strike against the evil God hypothesis. So basically, the privation theory of evil. So a point we make in the paper is that often the way that people have tried to defend the privation theory of evil is in terms of saying, think of some good things and then think of some evil things. I don't know, like war or I don't know, murder, let's say. Well, when you and the claim is that, well, when you think about it, it looks as though these things are sort of parasitic upon good things. So murder is parasitic upon the good of life. Murder is an evil thing, but it couldn't just stand in its own right. It's sort of metaphysically dependent on goodness. Now, that way of defending the privation theory of evil, just sort of by appealing to cases, particular cases, and then sort of trying to argue that the best way to understand them is in terms of evil being parasitic upon goodness, it's kind of okay. But the problem is it's a bit piecemeal. And so what we say in the paper is that we think the better way to defend the privation theory of evil is to put forward a comprehensive kind of metaphysical claim about the nature of goodness in general. And from that particular theory, the privation view of evil just kind of falls out. So the idea is the theory of goodness that we have in view is what's sometimes called the functional view of goodness, or the attributive view, and this is very much kind of the Aristotelian view of things. So as I said, many contemporary philosophers would see themselves as Aristotelian in some sense, and so this is definitely something to be reckoned with. So the basic idea is that goodness, there is no such thing as just good, full stop. There's only a good kind of X, right? There's a good car, there are good husbands, good aeroplanes, good shoes, but there's no such thing as just good, in the abstract. So in other words, for something to be good is for it to be an excellent thing of the kind that it belongs to, for it to fulfill its function excellently. And then, the corollary of that is that to be evil is to be a poorly functioning instance of the kind of thing. And so, basically, the way that the privation view falls out of this view of goodness is that evil is just kind of defined in relation to goodness. Evil is just to be a bad, a poorly functioning instance of an X. And so in that sense, you can't, evil is kind of metaphysically subordinate to goodness. And the upshot of all of this is that if that theory of goodness and evil is true, the good God hypothesis, it is intrinsically kind of incoherent in that the thought being that you can't have a metaphysically ultimate evil being, because evil is metaphysically subordinate to goodness. So you can't have the metaphysically ultimate reality. And I take it if the word God means anything, it means that which is metaphysically ultimate. So you can't have a metaphysically ultimate reality which is evil if this theory of goodness and evil is true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to sum that point up, I have a quote from the paper. You say, I guess Ben might have written this section, but you were in it as well. So you say, we suggest that the simplest and most natural expression of the privation theory of evil is that goodness involves the things doing what it is supposed to do, and badness involves the things not doing what it is supposed to do. As such, if the privation theory of evil is correct, then an ontologically ultimate, wholly evil being is incoherent. Yeah. So now, when in my conversation with Asha Lancaster Thomas, I raised the worry, and I think she did it as well, that the evil god the evil god challenger can posit the privation theory of good. So just a mirror, it meant to be a mirror, but it does seem like on this functional account, the mirror doesn't work.
Yeah,
I think that's
I
the
think
real
that's what we want
advantage.
to say. I mean, I think that's right. So so the evil god hypothesis, the evil god challenger could try and sort of do a verbal redescription of the functional view of goodness, where they would say that, well, goodness is a failure to fail to fulfill. Is that right? Yeah, and goodness is a failure to fail to fulfill its thing's function, right? and evil is, to excellently fail to fulfill its a thing's function. But I think the point we make is that sort of verbal redescription move just seems not to be the most natural way to describe what's going on in that theory. It's like, say, so yes, you can describe writing left-handed as writing with the end of a limb that's neither one's right hand nor one's feet, right? But that doesn't seem to be the most natural way to describe what's going on there, right? So yeah, we think that if you do it in terms of this general metaphysical thesis about what goodness is, it's not really vulnerable to that mirroring move. Whereas I think evil God challengers have tried to parody the sort of cases that were put forward by some privation theorists in the past, where the piecemeal approach, where you pick a case of evil and you describe it in terms of a failure of goodness. So I do think you can mirror things more with that piecemeal approach, but we want to say that's not a very good approach to defending the privation theory.
Yeah, so at this point, we're looking at that first type of symmetry, which is intrinsic symmetry, and we're seeing, okay, what kind of like metaphysical commitments is the good God hypothesis compatible with, and the same question, or is the evil God hypothesis compatible with those? And it looks like the evil God hypothesis is not compatible with a privation theory of evil of the sort like this Aristotelian functionalist account. But the good God hypothesis would be compatible with that. So automatically, in terms of like the scales, it seems like the scale tips in favor of good God hypothesis right now, because it is compatible with something that evil God is not.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's the thought. Yeah.
Okay. Now you mentioned moral motivation as a second kind of, I guess, metaphysical commitment or something that, a view that good God hypothesis is compatible with, but evil God's not. So explain that one.
Yeah. Okay. So this is moral motivation internalism is sometimes known as the guise of the good thesis. So the idea is that you can only have a genuine sort of all things considered, all things taken into consideration desire for X if you think that X is a good thing. That's for what it's worth, that's a thesis that has been defended by some of the kind of towering figures in Western philosophy. Socrates, Plato, Aquinas, I think all held this view. Now, that doesn't mean it's true, but I mean, I think it means at least it needs to be taken seriously. So the idea is this. The evil God is supposed by hypothesis to be omniscient, to know everything. Okay, so the idea is, well, if even the evil God knows infallibly what is good and what is evil, well, if you combine that with this guise of the good thesis, which says that, well, you can only truly desire something that you take to be good, well, then the evil God could never genuinely desire that which is evil. And so the concept of an evil God breaks down, because I take it that being evil just sort of is constituted by having evil desires. So the combination of divine omniscience, which entails knowing genuinely that which is good and that which is bad, with this thesis that says that you can only truly desire that which you take to be good, means that God can't, as a sort of conceptual matter, can't ever desire that which is evil, and so an evil God is impossible.
Right. Okay. In the interest of time, I think we'll keep pressing forward. We could talk about that more, but I'm going to move on. So that's the intrinsic symmetry. And it looks like, okay, in terms of intrinsic symmetry, that breaks down. There's a couple of areas where evil God seems incompatible with these kinds of theses, but good God is compatible with them. Okay, so set intrinsic symmetry aside. Now let's turn to natural theology symmetry. You also argue in the paper that this breaks down as well. This symmetry breaks down. So explain places where you think it breaks down.
Yeah, okay. So so again, natural theology symmetry is the claim that all of the kind of natural theological evidence in the world, or in other words, all of the kind of arguments for there being a God, lend just as much support to a good God, an evil God, as they do to a good God. Okay, so I mean, we do make a few different points, and I'll try and keep this quite focused. So basically, in what you'll find in a lot of contemporary natural theological arguments is that they're formulated probabilistically. And the simplest way to explain the structure of those arguments is that they're saying there's some phenomenon, whether it's fine-tuning or consciousness or whatever, and this phenomenon is more strongly predicted, or it's more what we would expect given the existence of God than given naturalism, the non-existence of God, plus a few other propositions. So again, the idea is you've got some phenomenon, let's call it E, for E the evidence, and E is much more strongly expected, it's much more probable given theism than given naturalism. And so it's said to, if that's true, then the E confirms theism over naturalism. Okay, so the way one of the ways we approach this issue of natural theology symmetry in the paper is to ask the question, so we focus particularly on fine-tuning and consciousness. And let's just, nothing I'm going to say here really, we can just kind of lump those two things together for the purposes of this discussion. Let's just call that E, fine-tuning and consciousness. So the question we ask in the paper is E just as strongly predicted by an evil God as it is by a good God, right? And for natural theology symmetry to hold, it needs to be the case that the answer is yes, that an evil God predicts E just about as strongly as the good God predicts E, right? And we basically just raise, the way I would want to frame it more is, I wouldn't say we have sort of like killer objections to that claim, but I think we want to raise some questions and cast some doubt on the idea that the two hypotheses predict E just as strongly. So one thing we say is that, well, I'll focus on just two of the points we make. So the first thing we say is that the good God hypothesis makes E very probable, we think, because of the nature of goodness. So goodness, many authors have suggested is what you could call diffusive. So sort of goodness by nature just kind of wants to expand and wants to kind of overflow, right? So if God is perfectly good, then there's a very high probability that God will want to create for goodness to kind of overflow. By contrast, with the evil God, there's no such expectation, and actually, that the point we make is that there's a number of different ways that the psychology of an evil God could work, and some of them seem to be such that evil God would not create anything at all, but would probably kind of want to just self-destruct. So if evil God sort of from eternity past is just consumed by hatred, then that, including self-hatred, then it might well be that evil God has no interest at all in creating anything. It just wants to kind of stay in this self-focused state of self-hatred. And now the point we make is not that that's the only way the psychology of an evil God could work, but that it does seem to be one way that it could work. And we kind of whereas with a perfectly good God, we suggest that it's clearer why a good God would want to create. Now, yes, and one possible evil God sort of mindset might be they want to create creatures in order to torture them. Okay, but equally, we think, that the nature of an evil God might be such that, or the psychology of an evil God might be such that it just wants to kind of torment itself, and sort of just stay in that state forever. So already we want to suggest there's some reason to think that evil God is not does not predict E as strongly as the good God predicts it. The other thing we say is about the nature of love. So if a good God is perfectly loving, it seems, I mean, if not entailed, it's very natural that a good God would want creatures that are loving and can have loving personal relationships with each other and with God. So that again, that gives a kind of rationale for creating creatures who are capable of loving, whereas that there isn't a kind of a parallel situation with the evil God. Oh, Jordan, I've lost your audio for some reason.
I'm sorry, I muted myself. So let me mention something that's in a paper by, I think Luke Wilson is his name, and I might even be getting his point incorrect, and if so, I apologize. I'm summarizing based on what I read, and I may have misunderstood. But I thought this was related to this point you're making. So in terms of what you would expect, you base that on like the kinds of desires that good God would have and the kinds of desires that evil God would have.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like evil God's going to have a particular desire that good God doesn't, that's going to cast doubt on what you would expect. And this is the idea. If evil God hates itself, and like you said, maybe it doesn't, but it seems like that's at least possible. That it seems like evil God may well, if he really is evil, may hate himself. So as long as that's a genuine possibility, then you have to entertain the idea that because evil God would hate itself, it would desire to frustrate its own desires. Does that, and
Something like
and if
that.
but you're not going to have that in good God. Good God's not going to desire to frustrate its own desires. But evil God may, because it hates itself.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, if evil God does desire to frustrate its own desires, then now, in terms of, well, what would you expect? Would you expect evil God to act in a way that satisfies its desire to like torture things, or would you expect it to act in a way that wants to frustrate that because it's I want to, you know what I mean? That's the idea.
Yeah, exactly. And our point isn't that evil God entails, the concept of an evil God entails self-hatred and thus no creation, but it's more just that it seems like a much more open possibility that it would want to frustrate its own desires than is the case for the good God.
Okay, we're coming up. It lasts like 15 minutes here, so let's turn to this final symmetry, which is the theodicy symmetry. Why do you think the theodicy symmetry fails?
Yeah, so I mean, we make a few different points on this, but I'm just going to focus on one particular point. So it rests on a thought experiment, which I'll ask you to take part in, Jordan. So the idea is consider a world that we might call torture world. So every creature in torture world, at every kind of second of its existence, is experiencing just a tremendous amount of pain, and this just goes on forever. Okay, and then imagine what we might call mixed world, where mixed world is basically a lot like our world. There's pleasure and there's pain, and you sort of seemingly get to make free choices to kind of navigate your way through this world. There's some sense in which you seem to be responsible for some of the outcomes of your actions and so on. And it's a mix of pleasure and pain. So we call that mixed world. So the first thing I want to ask you, Jordan, is which of those two worlds would you prefer to be in?
Oh, I'd much rather be in mixed world.
Right, which is, I think, what virtually any sane human being would say. Okay, so then now let's add in a third world. We call this bliss world. So in bliss world, you are experiencing untrammeled bliss for every moment of your existence, but you're not. You're sort of completely passive. You're just. It's a little bit like Robert Nozick's experience machine.
That's what I was
right?
thinking.
You kind of machine. You're just sort of given pleasurable experiences on tap, but you're not kind of responsible for them. You're as passive in bliss world as you are in torture world, right?
Mm-hmm.
You just kind of sit back and you're just given pleasurable experiences. Which world would you prefer to be in, Jordan, out of mixed world or bliss world?
I still lean toward mixed world, though it's a more difficult choice to make than the other one. The other one's like almost automatic, but I think overall, I'd still go to mixed world.
Yeah. Now, good. Now, I think the survey responses here would be different, but what I would still, I still very much would expect is that even those people, I think some people would go for bliss world. But I almost guarantee that they would think about it for a few seconds. They wouldn't just automatically say, "Oh, it's obviously bliss world," in the way that you said, "Well, it's obviously got to be mixed world over torture world."
Mm-hmm.
So here's the simple point: evil God has overwhelming reason to create torture world, because it's the world that we would least like to be in, right? If let's grant the evil God challenger that the evil God has a sort of a very kind of orderly divine psychology where it doesn't hate itself, or at least it's not trying to frustrate its own desires. It just wants to torture creatures. Well, it should create torture world, because that's the one we would hate to be in. It's the one we would absolutely least like to be in, right? Good God doesn't seem to have similarly overwhelming reason to create bliss world over mixed world, right? And the point simply is this: our world is a mixed world. That is much stronger evidence against the evil God than it is against the good God. Because the evil God has overwhelming reason to create the torture world. That's the world you would expect an evil God to create, if it creates any world at all. On the other hand, the choice, as you were suggesting, the choice between would you prefer to be in mixed world or bliss world, that's it's a more difficult choice. It's not, let's say, just overwhelmingly obvious that you should want to be in bliss world. And what that means is that bliss world is not nearly as strongly predicted by the good God hypothesis as torture world is by the evil God hypothesis. And hence mixed world is much more, less kind of unexpected given the good God than it is given the evil God. And so the symmetry breaks between the good God and the evil God when it comes to the problem of good or the problem of evil, however you want to frame it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think you explained all three symmetries really well and explained your reasons for thinking those symmetries don't hold. I'll mention one interesting symmetry breaker that I don't know that it's been developed much. I can think of one paper where it's been developed, and that is there's practical reason to believe in
good God
over evil God.
Yes, I
And I
think this is Tasia Scrotton who talks about this, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
and I mentioned this to Asha Lancaster Thomas specifically because in the paper that Asha wrote, she seemed to brush this idea off pretty quick, and I thought,
Mm.
huh, it actually seems like a pretty good point to me, and she seemed to agree with me after I explained it this way, and I just wanted to get your thought.
Mm.
Maybe this would go back to natural theology in a sense. It's like, okay, we look at natural theology and say someone says, okay, I don't know the nature of the cause of the universe or the nature of the thing that fine-tuned the universe or whatever, but that there is a cause, that there is a fine-tuner, that much I think the argument can get you to.
Mm-hmm.
But then from there, just at that point, you can say, now, when it comes to whether this being would be good or evil, which do I have better reason to believe? And pragmatic, like practical reason.
Yeah.
And it seems like you'd have to say, good God, it would just mess up your psychology so bad if you thought there really is an evil being out
Mm-hmm.
there to just bent on my destruction. That would very much mess with you. You don't have very good practical reason to believe that when the evidence is just as compatible with
Yeah.
there's a good God that really loves me and wants me to thrive. And it seems like you have very good practical reason to prefer belief in good God.
Mm. Yeah, I'm sympathetic to that. And I think the way you just explained it there is a particularly poignant way of explaining it.
All right. Well, I know we are at time. We got 4 minutes. So if you could do this in 60 seconds, that would be amazing because I could turn it into a little short video. But I guess if somebody asked you, Max, why do you think the evil God challenge fails?
So the good God and the evil God hypothesis are symmetrical. They're sort of on a par. Only if you know they are symmetrical in the following three respects. Firstly, the sort of concepts themselves are have just as good a claim as each other to being intrinsically coherent. The second thing is that the natural theological arguments for the existence of God, lend just as much support to the evil God as they do to the good God. And thirdly, that the problem of evil and the problem of good, the problem of why an evil God would allow goodness, are symmetrical in the sense that there is just as much of a problem for each, and all of the responses that can be given on behalf of each hypothesis can be sort of reversed with just as much plausibility. And in a nutshell, I think that each of those symmetry claims breaks down and can't be upheld, and hence the evil God challenge doesn't succeed.
All right. Well, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll mention the paper once more. So in the link in the description of this video, you can get access to this paper. It's an excellent overview of the Evil God Challenge. Thank you so much, Max, for joining me. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Jordan.
All right, go check out the interview with Dr. Asha Lancaster Thomas if you haven't seen it already. And if you enjoy the content on this channel, please consider becoming a patron. You get to participate in the book club, be a part of the private Facebook group, and get early access to videos. The link to become a patron's in the description. Thank you for watching. See you next time.